Well, good morning. I'm hoping that our time together this morning will be really a practical time to think about evangelism um, and as hopefully has been the case throughout these days, a time for you to ask questions. So if you've come here today for me to give you all the answers, I'm going to tell you that I think one of the biggest answers is to ask questions. That we are in a time when having sort of canned methods, canned answers, easy ways of doing things is not very helpful. But it's also an exciting time when, as we do ask questions, we open our lives and our churches up to allowing God to lead us in new ways, in ways that maybe we wouldn't have thought of otherwise. And that's the Holy Spirit's work, as I say, in sometimes unexpected ways to lead us to new things in this new time. So let's just begin with prayer, and then we'll go through a bunch of things today. Heavenly Father, we are thankful for the commission that we've received from Jesus to go and make disciples. Thankful that we are your witnesses, just as Jesus said. And we're thankful for a time during these days to think about what it means to reach out of our faith communities to those around us, what it means to love our neighbor as ourselves, what it means to live in such a way that our lives really are letters from you to the people who know us. Our lives begin to communicate the gospel. Thank you for ways in which we as leaders and our congregations are connected to people who need to hear good news, for the opportunities, really the exciting opportunities that we have. Give us wisdom, and as we think through a number of things today, help us to think about our own communities and how you might lead us if we look to you. Thanks for everyone who's here. I pray all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So most of you know me pretty well, I think, but I'll just say a couple of things to begin with, and that is that as I talk today, it will be from a context, obviously, and part of my context is my own experience, certainly as a pastor, and you heard me say on Monday afternoon that my experience as a pastor is that things have changed so much that in my early time in pastoral ministry, there seemed to be sort of a way of doing things that if pastors sought to do today would I think lead to very little in terms of evangelism. So much of what I'll talk about has to do with my experience of change, and then in more recent years, my experience in leadership in our own church, so at River Cross Church in St. John, where my wife and I, our main area of ministry is with international students / immigrants who come to our city and then come to our church. And so you'll hear a bit of that in what we're going to talk about today, because a lot of those people are people who have different religions who come to St. John, come to Canada, and not only would not describe themselves as Christians, but would say they are Buddhist, they are Muslim, they are Hindu, they are of another religion. So we'll talk about that a bit, because that's been my recent experience. The other side is, of course, research, and that is some of this is my own research. I've even in the last few months done a fair amount of travel to look and see what's happening in churches in other parts of North America. And also the research that I'm involved in, I shouldn't say involved in, I'm not a part of it, but research that I'm aware of through my networks with other sociologists who are working in the area of congregational studies. So hopefully some of those things will come through that will provide a sense of what I see happening today and ways that God is working today effectively through his church. So I want, and this is probably not the best term, but it's a term that I've used in my class, and so you're going to hear it. I want to think about the people that we've not been reaching. So the sort of the worst case scenario, if I can put it that way, is that our churches become very insular, and we end up with very few connections in the wider community beyond our own families. Maybe a few friends, but even friendships often are with other people within the church. So we end up with very few meaningful connections beyond that. And when I talk about people who are unreached, I'm thinking of people that are considerably beyond that small circle. So the people that never go where we go, the people whose lives are being lived for very different priorities than what most people in our churches would ever think was a priority. People who have a very different view of the church from our view of the church. I mean, it always amazes me when I'll be surveying congregations, for example, and I'll go to a congregation and I just think to myself, what must they be paying people to endure a service like I'm sitting through, And after the service, people come to me and they'll say, "Don't you just love our little church?" We get ourselves into what we're used to mode, and we have no sense of how other people see the church. So again, I'm talking about those people who would look at what we're doing and say, bang me over the head 20 times instead of making me do that. How do we reach those people? So how do we reach out from the church culture? This, culture that for us in Atlantic Canada, I think has built up over a period of 150 or more years. How do we reach out from that culture that's become so strong within our congregations, now increasingly narrow? To say there was a time when the church culture was very much like the Atlantic Canadian culture, but as the church culture is much different now, how do we reach out to the secular culture around us? And I guess the first thing that I would say from my experience is that it won't happen unless we determine it will happen. So if we sit back and say, well, we'll just be the church and hopefully it's not going to happen. There has to be an intentionality to it. And that shouldn't surprise us, because I think when Jesus was talking to his disciples, when Paul was writing to the churches, he was writing in a time when the church culture, which was very small in that time, was massively, I mean, the difference between the church culture and the pagan culture of the Roman Empire, or even the Jewish culture of the Judea, massively different. So we can look to Scripture and we can see ways in which Jesus prepared his disciples to cross those boundaries, to build those bridges. But Jesus prepared them because it was something they're going to have to do with intentionality. So I think that in our churches today, we need that intentionality, or else we will never reach most people. We may reach some, but they'll be the people close to us in thinking. But we'll not reach most people. And in our society today, when most people are part of this unreached group, we have to be intentional. So I think one of the first things that I have found helpful is to help the church. I don't think that's just something that sort of a leader does on their own, but to help a church to say, who are the people in our community who are not reached? This is the beginning of the intentionality, I would say. Because most Christians, most church members, I think, live life without even noticing that people are very different from them. And it takes some focus for people to begin to notice how many people around us live life differently. So can we identify groups who are the unreached in our community? These are often the people who are invisible to church people. So I think that's a question to ask people, because in our different communities, the answer will be different. So again, I've just put down a few things that I find, I mean, honestly, I think we should think of this immediately, but we don't. Some of these people are invisible. Do you realize how many people in your community work in retail? And what does that mean to them if the one gathering in your church building is on Sunday morning at 10:30 or 11? It means you've got this, and who are these people? They are teenagers. They are university students who are trying to earn money. They're the people that we want to reach. And we've essentially made it impossible for them to ever come when we are meeting. So again, just stopping to think. Now, actually, I have written an article that caused quite a bit of stir back, it's been 3-ish years ago now, that talked about this idea of Sunday not being sacred anymore. I would go to declining congregations and I would say, why is your congregation in decline? And the number one answer that everybody gave to me was, in every church, the number one answer people gave was shopping on Sunday, sports on Sunday. That's why our church is in decline, sports on Sunday. And I would look at them, I'd say, you really think that if the hockey rink closed on Sunday, your church would be full? Okay, but so the phrase I kept hearing, people say, Sunday's no longer sacred. Okay, Sunday's no longer sacred. Big bottom lip, Sunday's no longer sacred. And I wanted to say, like, I would go to growing congregations, and here's what they would say to me. They would say, Sunday is no longer sacred. All 7 days are sacred now. Right. So we have to think differently. I mean, whether it's retail workers or families who have kids in sports or whatever it is, the people who are never going to show up no matter what you do on Sunday morning at 11. Well, Sunday's no longer sacred. Sunday morning at 11 is not the only time you can worship God. So we need to think, are these people we want to reach? Now, to be honest, again, in many of these declining congregations, basically people would say, well, we shouldn't have to change for the world. You know, we've staked our ground. Sunday at 11 is God's time, and we're not changing for the world. Well, that's fine if you don't want to reach the world. So, different people who live in different social circles from those of church folks. Again, I just think, just ask ourselves, in my city, in my village, in my community, are there people that just are not in our circles? This requires a change in thinking about people because, frankly, I think in some churches there's the attitude, well, yeah, but they're the bad people in the community. Well, maybe we need to say instead, they're actually the lost people in our community. They're the people that need to hear the gospel. So to ask ourselves, how do we be intentional about reaching those people? Stats Canada, their general social survey, really has shown, I think, shocking data to show that what has happened among the four mainline denominations in Canada really over the last 30 years. So United, Anglican, Presbyterian, and Lutheran, the mainline denominations. And the fact that really the youth have disappeared. From the mid-'80s, when there were still a lot of youth in those denominations, and they've essentially disappeared from those denominations today. And really that disappearance had happened by 2005. Again, think of the General Social Survey data from Stats Canada. So, I mean, essentially 12 years ago, there were no youth left in those denominations. Those are now, emerging adults. Their parents grew up in the mainline denominations, and the parents stopped going to church, but were still sort of affiliated. Now, all these young adults on the survey say, no religion. No religion. This is a huge segment of Canadian society. Do we ever think about reaching those people? The fact that people move now. I mean, my mother was one of 9 children, and well, 7 of them lived, close enough you could. Well, I guess you have to drive, but I mean, they didn't leave home very far. One of them moved to Boston. Can you imagine? But other than, they pretty much, because that's what people did. Well, today I'll talk to people and they start telling me where this family member's in California and this one's in BC and this one's in Europe and this. And they don't live there for a lifetime. It's a mobile society. Talk to people who are transferred in their jobs every 2 years. Well, we tend to depend in our churches on long-term relationships. Do we ever think about mobile families? Do we think about ways in which, for example, we can use digital media to help people to put down at least virtual roots, even though they are moving? When we build friendships with people and they move away, do we just say, well, they're gone? Or do we think, my witness needs to continue to that person? I think that in our society for, well, most of my life, people with disabilities are pretty much invisible because they couldn't go anywhere. And they can go places now, except many of our churches. And I've heard church people say, well, thank goodness we're grandfathered in. We don't have to worry about all of these accessibility things. And I think, anyway, so we'll see what I think. But, one of my great thoughts, if you were ever in Main Street Baptist Church in St. John, you would know that you couldn't go anywhere without going up or down steps. I mean, it took an architectural genius, I'm sure, to figure out how to put steps between every area of the church. And I remember when we moved to our new building, which is all one level, I walked in the first Sunday and there was a girl, I don't know, then she's probably maybe 12 or so, who has braces on her legs and braces on her arms. And she came out of the children's area and she yelled, "Mom, no stairs!" Because they'd had to carry her up and down stairs in the old building. And again, it just struck me, we need to reach people that had barriers even from coming to our buildings. What about people who fear they will be judged because of lifestyle choices? Have we decided that they need to clean up their act first before they hear the gospel? Yes, we'd like to see you saved, but not until you make some changes. Are we adding some requirements that God doesn't require? Have we put requirements before the gospel? People who have other, and again, for us in Canada, this is an increasing reality. People with other cultural and or religious backgrounds that we fear or misunderstand. People who live differently because their culture is different from ours. People who again follow a different world religion. Do we think? Do we see those people as our neighbors, or do we see them as outsiders in our midst? You know, at what point do they no longer carry that status of outsiders? And I think for us as Christians, I think we should be the first in our communities to say, no, these people aren't outsiders. But sadly, I think sometimes we're among the last in our communities, mostly because of fear. So how do we notice who are the people in our community, and do we see them as people with whom we should share the good news of Jesus, or have we left them at the margins in our communities? And what about the people that you know, as soon as you start talking about church, they're going to swear at you. They're going to try to offend you. They're going to show you what they think of church because they used to be in church. And they have rejected church, and they'll let you know they'd reject you just as fast. Which, in my opinion, means they're actually quite open to the gospel if we can just show them that we do care about them and that we understand their need. But again, I think these are people that we tend to push aside because these are difficult encounters. And they're encounters that, I guess, in my experience, can become more difficult before sort of the change takes place, because the more they start to feel attracted to Christ, the madder they get, because it's going against what they've rejected. So again, have we written off certain people? I think sadly we make decisions about who are the people who are easiest to reach and who are the people who are hardest to reach. And from my experience, sometimes we're exactly wrong in that. We see one person say, well, you know, they're a good person. And, you know, they grew up in church, and, you know, it's worth the effort to be a witness to them. When many times they are the ones who will be the hardest to reach. And some of the people we say, well, you know, there's obviously no interest in the gospel there. And they just need somebody to love them. Okay, so again, I haven't given you anything here for answers really, except to say I think a beginning place is to ask, who are the people who become invisible to us? Who are the people that are right around us, that are in our communities? Maybe in our families, maybe our neighbors, maybe working at the store that we go to every week. Who are the people that we never think of in terms of witness? And we need to begin to be intentional about making disciples, about going and making disciples. So, second stage, I guess, and again, this is really not answering either. These are still things to hopefully help you to question. We have barriers to cross with the gospel. I talked about this on Monday, so I'm not going to say too much more, but it still amazes me. You know, my first church in the 1980s, I preached every Sunday from the King James Version of the Bible. And I didn't do that because I was a King James only, you know, whatever. It's because that's what every Baptist church. You know, I mean, the NIV had just come out, like, what, 1973 or something like that, but it hadn't taken off yet, really. You know, and the people who came who weren't Christians, they could talk in King James English pretty well too, because they'd grown up in Sunday school. Well, things have changed, and there are lots of barriers. So how do we cross those barriers? Well, the first thing that's hard for me, and I'm sure is easy for all of you, is to listen instead of talking. So we had built up a church culture. We had established a church culture that where the focus was one person behind a pulpit, everyone else sitting in pews, not even so they could see one another, but looking straight ahead, so that it was total one-to-many, one-way communication. We had Sunday school classes. Again, the church I grew up in, wonderful church, the church I grew up in, these little pillbox rooms, one after another, with a table and chairs so tight that the children couldn't move, and the teacher with the quarterly who would teach for an hour. One person, there were no discussion questions when I grew up in Sunday school. The teacher taught, the children listened. So we have people who think that is church. One-way communication. So this is a harder thing than perhaps it seems in just putting it up here. In churches, to help people to realize that for us to be witnesses, we need to listen to our community. We need to listen to our neighbors. We need to hear their questions. We need to have a sense of their lives. We've become very good at talking. All of the evangelism training, and I can think of at least 3 courses that I went through, not counting seminary, which would be a 4th one, where we went through these sort of formal how to be a witness courses. None of them mentioned listening. Okay, they all had, step A and step B and step C, this, and finally the sinner's prayer. We need to listen instead of just talking. In a congregational setting, we need to learn to dialogue instead of preaching. Somebody was asking the other night, Monday night, about, well, if programs don't work, why did Alpha work so well? Well, I think that was the key of Alpha. It was almost a shock to people when they came that we didn't just preach to them. We actually sat them around and said, "What are your questions?" We listened to them. I still remember the first Alpha course in St. John, 1997, and I was leading a group of 14 people, half of whom were, dyed in the wool Baptist church folks. And I started, with, so it begins with some discussion questions, and you can just see the Baptists. I mean, they're wonderful folks, good, faithful, but you can just see, just, they're just thinking the answer is Jesus. Okay, whatever the question is, the answer is Jesus. And so, I mean, they're giving these half-hearted answers, to help me. And, about 10 minutes into the discussion, a man that no one knows speaks up, and he begins by saying, "Well, actually, I don't believe there's a God, but I have some questions." And everyone in the group, you just see, like, suddenly they're like sitting up straight, and they're thinking, "Oh my goodness, like what I say matters here?" Because really, in church, nothing anybody said mattered. Like if you're in a Sunday school class, adult class, and the teacher asks a question, well, you just give it doesn't matter. And suddenly I'm thinking, my goodness, we have an atheist here in this group. Everything I say matters. And then some other people started speaking up, and we discovered we had a number of people in the group who had no belief. Look, I'll tell you, those dyed-in-the-wool Baptists were transformed by the fact that they realized I'm actually with people who need to hear the gospel. And we're having a discussion here. It's not just up to the person behind the pulpit. I have to be a part of this. Dialogue instead of just preaching. I think this is especially true when it comes to people of other religions, and I'll single out Islam especially. But I think for many people from parts of the world that have experienced colonial expansionism, the term Christian is not a positive word. And not for religious reasons, but for really political, sort of historical, geopolitical reasons. That the word Christian means the enemy. It has nothing to do with Christian belief. It's about military things. It's about political things. It's about resources being removed at a country's expenses, all of those things. So that's what Christians did. But I think sometimes even our lifelong Canadian neighbors hear the word Christian, and it means something different to them than it does to us. It means something institutional. Well, maybe that's what it means to us too, sadly. But they don't see it the way that we do in terms of following Jesus. So if we talk about becoming Christians, they see it as, well, do I want to join that club? I'm already in the Rotary, like it's not a life transforming thing. It's you're a member of that little group that doesn't agree with this other group. So we need to present Jesus instead of presenting Christianity. Be an obvious phrase there. We need to learn to love. We need to genuinely love our neighbors. That means building authentic, genuine relationships. I'll tell you a brief story, which has a good ending in this case, but that really was unusual, I think. So a woman began attending our church who, I guess I would just generally say, seemed somewhat troubled to me. I mean, I'd never met her before, but she was coming by herself each week, and I'd just see her at the door. But every week she was coming. And I would say as she was coming to our church, things seemed to be getting a little better week by week. So at some point, I had a talk with her and discovered she was actually a new Christian, had recently become a Christian. I thought, this is unusual to have someone who's become a new Christian and is now coming to our church. So she came in to see me in my office, and we had a chat to find out, what we could do in terms of being helpful. So here was her story. She was an only child. Both of her parents died in quick succession, and she was single, probably in her 30s. So like the two parents died less than a year between. And another woman in her workplace really befriended her in the midst of this very difficult time in her life. And this other woman was a very vibrant Christian who, over a period of time of this friendship developing, began inviting this woman to come to her church with her. And so she began going to that church quite faithfully, made a decision based on this good friend that she had, based on the people she'd gotten to know at this church. She made a decision she wanted to follow Jesus. So she did. She was baptized. And she said something really strange happened. She said, at work, this other woman who had been such a good friend was ignoring me. I mean, she wasn't unfriendly, but she had no time for me, didn't want to take any time after work, nothing. She said, I'm thinking, what have I done, to offend? someone who is such a wonderful friend. So finally, she pulled her aside and said, what have I done wrong? Whatever it is, I'm sorry, what have I done wrong? And the other woman said, oh, she said, it's nothing to do with that. She says, but now that you're saved, I've moved on to somebody else. This was devastating to her. She realized that there had been no genuine friendship from day one. This was missionary friendship. This was be a friend, until I have another check mark on my list of converts. But once the person had become a Christian, she had no more time for her because there was a new person on her list. Now, that's maybe the extreme. But I think it emphasizes how important authentic, genuine friendships are. So again, it's not that we say, now we want to see some people saved. Who will I become friends with so that I can do that? I think Jesus has called us to love our neighbors, and we should just love them. And loving them, obviously we want to introduce them to Jesus because we love them. Again, it seems like it should go without saying, but obviously it needs to be said. In our own experience, again, really over the last 10 years that we've been doing international ministry, I have been amazed at the place of hospitality. I mean, when we had kids growing up, we didn't have time for hospitality. We had a hard enough time getting ourselves together at one meal. But once the kids were gone, it suddenly became much easier for us to open our home. And something as simple as a meal, for people who are 10,000 miles from their family, means more than I ever would have realized. Simply saying to people, why don't you come to our place, for Thanksgiving? You're not used to Thanksgiving. We'll have a turkey here. We will show you what Canadian Thanksgiving is like. And to have people say, well, could I bring some of my friends? Sure. Now my friends are all Muslim, but they want to come to a Canadian Thanksgiving. My friends are Hindu. And suddenly, when it started out, we thought we were inviting 7 people and 30 people come in the door. It's a realization that our society has become less and less hospitable. There was a New York Times best-selling book, Robert Putnam's 2000 book, Bowling Alone, that talks about how in our society now, we don't even eat together. And if we do, we make a reservation at a restaurant. We'd never invite anybody to our home. That would take work, have them in our home. So we'll go to a restaurant and talk. But there's something about having people in your home that communicates to them a value and a willingness to let them see more of your life than you show when you're at a restaurant. I mean, most times when we have a bunch of people at our home, we've done our best to get the house cleaned up. But when you're cooking for 30 people at the same time, not everything gets dusted. They see you in ways that they wouldn't outside of your home. So you're saying to them, we will let you get to know us on a deeper level. I think those are powerful things. And again, when we look at the New Testament, when we look at Jesus, how often do we talk about Jesus, with the party at Matthew's place? Why was that such a significant event? I mean, it was hospitality. Here's Matthew and his gang, and Jesus is there. The early church, they are in one another's homes, going from house to house. I think we have opportunities through hospitality. As long as we don't have this attitude that our homes have to be showpieces of, I don't know, Canadian whatever, um, that it's just us. I remember years ago reading a book, I think it was called How to Build a Caring, Sharing Fellowship. I taught it actually as an adult course 2 or 3 times. But it was written by a pastor out in British Columbia who got people in his church to open up their homes to invite people to come. I mean, it was programmed because he couldn't get them to do it otherwise. So he set it up. People would open their homes. People signed, and he saw what they discovered was the people that had the great big houses with all the rooms. You know, everyone went to those houses and everything was neat. The maid had been there on Saturday and gotten everything cleaned, and so everything was perfect. And people went there and they sort of stood around and didn't talk, or sat around and didn't talk to anybody. Um, but the people who lived in mobile homes or small apartments, people went in there and they talked and talked and opened up, and because it was a sort of a real place. I mean, I think you can make a real place anywhere, but the point is, the point of hospitality is not to show what a good housekeeper you are. The point of hospitality is to say, we'll open our lives to you and let you open your lives to us. I mean, there obviously are things to think about in terms of hospitality. I may talk about this later, or I may have this on the screen later, but I'll talk about it now to make sure that I don't forget it. And that is, I mean, food is an issue, and some of you heard me say this in other contexts, I'm sure, but again, on Christmas Day this year, we had a bunch of people. I can't remember how many. I think only 17 this year for Christmas that came. But again, 2 of them were Muslim. It just, when I announced as the meal was being, as I said, the blessing for the meal, I just said to people, we have chicken dishes. Because I wasn't sure. I mean, there might have been people that I wasn't sure their religious background, but I thought that it was only 2 that were Muslim background. But I said, there are chicken dishes, there are beef dishes, there are some fish, there are vegetarian dishes, and I just said, and there are no pork dishes at all. And one of the men who was Muslim said, "Oh, thank goodness," because I mean, it allowed a level of I don't know, relaxation that he didn't have to be worrying about that. When we've had larger gatherings where we've had people who are Buddhist, who are Hindu, who are Muslim, we've been very careful to label each of the dishes, and if something does have pork in it or does have beef in it, to clearly identify that, so that again they can see that they don't have to worry that somehow we've snuck some bacon, into something. That it's very clear they know what they can eat. Again, it seems like a simple, practical thing. But I guess what I'd say is it's not only that it gives them a sense of being relaxed as they get their meal, but they appreciate it. It says to them that their religious beliefs are important to us. Okay, yeah, we've showed respect. Doesn't mean we agree with their religious beliefs, but we've shown that we respect them. And I think that's an important part of building the bridge to those people. I just, again, if I can tell a story I don't need to tell, but it really emphasizes the how Christians sometimes think, and that is, talking to one person who was saying that in another part of the world, and this is fairly recent, but somebody trying to build relationships with Muslims to begin a ministry of friendship with Muslims to be able to begin sharing the gospel, and facing really unexpected barriers. Why is this not working? Why are the Muslims so untrusting? Until he found out that another Christian had tried to do the same thing a few years back, had come and had befriended these Muslim folks, and they had opened their lives to this person, who then invited them to a swimming party. And after getting everybody underwater, as they come back up, He yells, "I've just baptized you all in the name of Jesus. You're no longer Muslims, you're now Christians." That didn't actually have the result that he was hoping for. It meant that they said, "Never again will we trust a Christian." So it meant that he had then to work a lot harder to build the relationship. So I say that to say, by saying to people, there's no pork in this, there's no beef in this, we're saying to them, you can trust us. We don't agree with your religious beliefs, but you can still trust us. It's an important part of building the relationship. I mean, some of this is not even, sort of to-do things. It's the fruit of the Spirit. It's Christ in us. It's the life of Christ being lived out in us. Grace, humility, gentleness, joy, self-control. Those are important aspects of crossing barriers. Thirdly, let's think a bit about some of the things that do, I think, need to change in outreach. The one that I keep mentioning in any forum where I'm speaking, because I think people are slow to understand this. We really are making disciples from scratch, I say, these days. It used to be that everyone who came to us, had some Sunday school background, had some Christian relatives influence background, had some sort of the Christian culture influence background. We can rely on none of these things anymore. We start as the Apostle Paul did as he headed out into Europe to talk to people who had never heard of Jesus, didn't know anything about the God even of the Old Testament. We make disciples from scratch. And I think our churches find this really difficult because we had the programs to make this unnecessary, we thought. As long as we have the children's programs, as long as we have Sunday school, as long as we have a youth pastor, as long as they, by the time they become adults, we just have to get them to say yes. Well, now we start from scratch. We start explaining the most rudimentary aspects of what it means to be a Christian, of who Jesus is. I remember one night at Alpha sitting with a university student, and he turns to me and he says, "So who is this Jesus anyways?" And this is before the first session. So, there's been no teaching at all. We're at the table eating dinner. And he says, "Who is this Jesus anyways?" And so I'm trying to sort of keep my theological language out of the conversation and begin to explain. And just out of the blue, he looks at me and says, "You mean he thought he was God?" Which he thought was hilarious. Which really hit me as saying, we need to make disciples from scratch. This was news to him, that Jesus thought he was God. That's our society today. Again, things that will require love and commitment, mentoring people. We tend to think of mentoring as taking the new Christian and helping them become a mature Christian, and that's a good reason for mentoring. I think some of our mentoring needs to start before people are Christians, as we help them to see how we are seeking to live out the life of Christ. Seeing that in us is going to go a long way toward helping them to understand what it will mean for them to decide to follow Jesus. Again, finding ways that are less individualistic, allowing people to be part of groups who are discussing questions. Again, hospitalities I've already mentioned. I think we need to help people to understand the church. It looks crazy to a lot of people. So we need to help people understand. And maybe that means we need to think about our own understanding of the church and how closely that fits with the vision that Jesus gives us of the church. I think a good question to ask is simply, what would it take for this person to become a mature follower of Jesus? Not just to make a decision, but what will it take for this person who maybe seems so far from being a Christian we can't even imagine that? What would it take for this person to become a mature follower of Jesus? To begin to see them, to begin to see their future differently. I've already mentioned listen. I think we need to forgive and we need to seek forgiveness. So in other words, there needs to be lots of grace. Some people with whom I've talked early in the process of sharing Christ are not that nice in response. And so we can take that very personally and miss opportunities. We need to just forgive those things. Leave them in the past. Let God deal with that. My job is to be a witness. And sometimes when we realize that we haven't been all that we should be or haven't said all that we should have said, we need to tell people that we're sorry, or that our church hasn't been all that it should have been. We need to say, we're sorry about this, because they may point out ways in which our church or particular people they know in our church have in some way caused hurt in their lives. And I think we need to do our very best to protect people from legalism, because because you know why. I'm not giving a theological reason why. But I guess what I'm saying is that I think we live in a time when, again, the people's sense that they need to look like good Christians, even if they're not Christians, that is long gone. And if they have a sense that being a Christian means doing these 533 rules, they're not even going to listen. Why would they? So I think we need to help them to understand that, and we need to help other people in the church understand that we're not expecting people to clean up their own lives before they come to Jesus. One of the worst examples I think of, and some of you have maybe heard me say this before too, because I've said it many, many, many times. I remember in my first church being so excited one Sunday, seeing a man getting out of his car in the parking area and coming towards the church who had never come to church. I mean, I talked to him many times. I thought there was sort of deep inside interest, but he wasn't showing any interest. And so here he's coming to church for no reason that I knew of, except he must have just decided to come to church this Sunday. And as he's coming toward the door, I see an older woman from the congregation who knows him well, walking towards him. She reaches over to him and she pats him on his shirt pocket and says, "Don't take those into the church." Pack of cigarettes in his pocket. Like, I'm standing here, I wanted to strangle her. Okay? I mean, it was not a Christian feeling I was having. But I thought to myself, like, for her, it apparently never went through her mind to rejoice that somebody in her community, for some reason, was coming to a worship service. Her concern was that there'd be cigarettes in the church. We need to protect people from legalism. he came to that service, and I'd like to say, and he was converted and everything else. And to my mind, he was not. He wasn't a Christian when I left the community. I know that. And I don't know what effect that had on him, at all. I know what effect it had on me. But I do think that in our communities, we are seen as more legalistic as we probably are. But then having said that, I think we are also probably more legalistic than we think we are. Finally, let's think for a few minutes about reaching people of other faiths. And these are my suggestions. Again, these are not sort of pronouncements from on high. I'd say the first thing is learn enough about the person's faith that you don't embarrass yourself or them. Be sensitive to customs. So once again, things like eating, things like dress, things like modesty, that may be different in other religious settings from ours. Knowing those things can prevent them from feeling embarrassed. And it can communicate to them that we really care about things that are important to them, even if they're not important to us. But in a sense, they're important to us because we know that they're important to them. I think that communicates something that's very important. I think we need to stop listening to TV. We need to rid ourselves of stereotypical ideas about their religion. I blame TV, and that's really probably not good, because I think, looking at my Sunday school life growing up in a Baptist church, wonderful teachers, but I think that they tried to scare us by presenting other religions in the worst light possible. Again, I think it's, how do I put this strongly enough? There is no salvation outside of Jesus Christ. But having said that, we don't have to sort of make up things to attack in other religions. So we need to be careful that we don't have stereotypical ideas about the religions of other people, nor that, I guess I would add, nor that we think that the most radical examples of those religions characterize those religions. As a Baptist, I would rather that people not think that I handle snakes. So I'm sure that as Muslims or as Buddhists or whatever, people would rather you didn't take the most extreme example of people who practice that religion and then, say that's everybody, because it isn't. On the other hand, what we do when people have stereotypical ideas of Christianity, and many people in other religious groups do, because the same thing has happened there. So when we're confronted by it, what we want to do is fight back and say, you think we're bad, well, what about you doing this? That's really helpful. Don't try to argue against them. The best way is to live in a way that disproves that stereotype. Offer practical help. Again, I think of people who are immigrants, for whatever reason. Many of them are here as students. Some have come as refugees. Some have come to get jobs here in Canada. A lot of them for professional or highly technical jobs that they've moved to Canada. Often they have a hard time speaking English. I talking to a couple in our church just less than a month ago. And the husband has moved to our city for a job. And he said to us, and he's the one with less interest in Christianity, I think. But he said to us at church, he said, is there any way that people could just talk to my wife? He said, she just needs a lot of practice talking English. She's gotten, so she doesn't like to go out because she can't speak English very well. So could there just be some people to just spend time with her, talking to her? Well, again, that's pretty practical. Just spend some time talking to her in English. could be a variety of things. Again, helping people who don't understand things in the Canadian culture, which we think, well, why would anybody not understand that? But of course, we would be the same in their culture. So helping, just practical help in understanding things. Show them you genuinely love them by helping. I just find it so helpful to think about the scriptures when I think about reaching people of other faiths, because the people in the scriptures were reaching people of other faiths. That's what they were doing. I mean, think of Paul heading into Europe. Obviously we have the example of the Sermon on Mars Hill and on all those things we talk about a lot, but really his whole ministry to Gentiles, he is crossing religious boundaries. Jesus, in the way that he reached out to the Jewish people, the early church, reaching out to pagans, to idol worshipers, how they dealt with some of the real difficult issues there, because they had people who had an idol worshiping background who'd become Christians. They had Jewish people who thought that idols were the worst thing ever, but didn't mind eating food sacrificed to idols because those idols meant nothing to them. All of those things they had to work through, and it's all in the scriptures to help us. And I think we need to overcome some myths. And the one myth that bothers me the most, because I hear it often from pastors. There's a myth that people of other faiths are resistant to the gospel. I don't think there's any truth to that. However, culture, history, and politics have made it difficult for some groups to hear the gospel. But once they hear it, the power of the gospel is the same as for everyone. So that's, I think, what we need to understand. It's not that people of other religious beliefs are resistant to the gospel. It's that people are resistant to some of the Western culture stuff that has gone with the gospel over the last 1,000 years or so. I'm sorry, this is getting quite small here to fit everything on. Muslims in North America, I think, are the example to bring up. It is true. It's absolutely true. We have not been very successful in reaching Muslims in North America with the gospel. Reg Bibi has done a fair amount of research in Canada, and he says that Buddhists, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, what other groups have actually there have been fairly significant numbers who converted to become Christians, but not very many Muslims have become Christians in Canada. However, that's not true in other parts of the world. It's not true in parts of the world, for example, that don't have a British Empire connection background. Evangelism among Muslims has been very effective in Asia. Lots of Muslims become Christians in Asia, millions. The problem is the historic animosity between Western culture and Islam. The problem is not the gospel. So if we're going to be effective in reaching Muslims with the gospel, we've got to do it in a way that does not tell them, and by the way, you have to become Western in your way of living. It's the Western culture and the historical problems related to that make Muslims resistant and make Christians less likely to build relationships of friendship and witness with them. I mean, again, I think an example is Iran. The government of Iran has, since the 1970s, been as ruthless as any in the world in trying to get rid of Christianity, and it keeps growing there. They have been executing leaders, they have been persecuting the church, and it keeps growing because Muslims keep becoming Christians, even though the government's trying to suppress it. The problem is not that Muslims don't become Christians. The problem is that Muslims don't want to become Westerners with all of the baggage of the past. Rodney Stark is a sociologist of religion, and he has demonstrated, I think, clearly in his works that so if we take away the power of the gospel, if I put it this way, which I don't want to do, But he's saying just if we think sort of on a rational basis, it's fairly easy. It's not fairly easy, that's too strong, but it is just not as rationally, what's the word? You can't back up rationally the idea of polytheism. So a religion of many gods that's confronted by a monotheistic religion tends to usually collapse, because people see that it just makes more sense to believe there's one God. Just as simple as that. From a purely rational, intellectual point of view, it makes a lot more sense. So Stark says this is one of the reasons why the gospel went like fire across the Roman Empire. Because when people heard that, all these various, shall we say, morally questionable gods that they were worrying about, that in fact there was one God, this was a massively more reasonable understanding of the universe. And so from a purely rational point of view, that barrier was gone. But what Stark says is that there's a difference when it comes to reaching out to Islam. Islam is also a monotheistic religion. And so we have to reach people who are Muslim, not through the rational argument that our beliefs are better than your beliefs. Again, it means sharing, as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, it means sharing our very selves. Evangelism, well, if you're in my Evangelism and Mission course, I have a number of readings that from people who've been very successful in Muslim evangelism, mostly in Africa and in Asia. And they just emphasize over and over and over the building of relationships that has led to so many Muslims becoming Christians. There's one particular article that I get my class to read that I love, because it talks about a Christian who's on, well, actually it's the author. The author is on a plane and a Muslim sits beside him, and they get into quite a discussion, and the Muslim becomes quite exercised in trying to argue that the Christian is wrong, loudly enough that everyone around in the plane is hearing this. And basically at the end of the whole thing, the author is saying it wasn't a matter of arguing my point. It was a matter of showing the Muslim that no matter how angry he got, I still loved him. And this is what was getting the Muslim so upset, sort of. And his comment at the end is, he said, I may never be able to out-argue a Muslim. But he said, as Christians, we should always be able to out-love them and out-forgive them. And I think that's just a neat way to understand how we need to be witnesses when we're crossing those religious boundaries. We must also understand some basic things about other religions to be witnesses to their adherents. Many Christians do not, and therefore come across as insulting and ignorant. I mean, some of this, I think people of other religions will be gracious and just know that we're ignorant. But, once again, I mean, how we, for example, how we treat Muslim women. We need to be careful. We need to realize that you can't just, run over and put your arm around somebody or shake their hand as maybe you would somebody who was a neighbor. You need to think those things through carefully and understand. Our motivation must be love, not fear. So again, when I hear people saying, well, we've got to do something about the Muslims, they're going to take over Canada. That's not the right motivation, just saying. Our motivation must be love, not fear. We must understand that they fear us. They wonder about us. Do we hate them? Are we mad that they're hearing people saying, oh, they're come taking our jobs? Do we hate them because they've come to Canada? Do we blame them for terrorism? Do we want them to move back to their country of origin? Conversion for people of other faiths involves not only acceptance of Christ, but also rejection. And I should say, this is Richard Hibbert, talks about these things. Conversion for people of other faiths involves not only acceptance of Christ, but also rejection, which can be painful and difficult, especially in light of family ties, culture, and religious identity. So again, things that they are used to, clothing, foods, rituals, and fear of Christians. So in the cultural Christian sense, as well as in the more specific sense. They might be afraid of us, but they might also be afraid of sort of, again, this sort of Western culture that they have been afraid of all their lives. We think of people becoming Christians and we think, well, what a joyous event. Imagine what it is for somebody who is thinking, if I become a Christian, my parents are not going to want to have anything to do with me. Or maybe my parents will want to have something to do with me, but my parents' friends will ostracize them because their son, their daughter, has become a Christian. So those things are going through their minds, that the decision to follow Jesus is going to bring about repercussions in their lives that it didn't bring about for us. So we need to understand that we're asking them to do something that is beyond what we have understood and experienced ourselves in deciding to become a follower of Jesus. Hibbert says there's an identity negotiation stage. So again, we want, as he says, we want instant conversions. You know, you made the decision at, 11:15 on Sunday, February, whatever, Hibbert says this is a big step for people who have other religious beliefs. We want instant conversions, but conversion involves the negotiation of a new Christian identity in light of both their old identity and their new identity. And the old identity is, so again, think of somebody who's a Muslim. When we think of being a Christian, we think of that in terms of our religious belief. When someone thinks of being a Muslim, they think of that in terms of their national citizenship, their political beliefs, everything. So it's a new identity. The old identity is culture, it's nationality, it's religion. That's one thing in Islam. It's not three things. You don't have a Muslim religion and then choose the other things. Muslim religion means a Muslim culture. It means your country is Muslim. While their new identity is also complex, because Christians seem to think that they can follow Jesus in a secular society. That's not how Islam thinks. So this is a whole new understanding of how they're going to make decisions and live their lives and raise their families. Oops, what did I just do? And how do I undo it? Good, okay, good. How smart I am. Accidental. Okay, in some cases, the Christian community may also be wary of accepting the convert, suspecting they may be spying on them, faking their conversion for material gain, or bringing unwanted persecution on them. Remember the response of the church to the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, Hibbert says. It took a Barnabas. Okay, and to make everybody really mad at me, I want to ask. So we, as I said, we now have a church where most Sundays we would have Muslims in church. We have Hindus in church pretty well every Sunday. My wife and I arrange transportation to get them there every Sunday. We have no religious symbols in our church. New people come from other Baptist churches, and one of the things they'll say in the foyer, they'll say, "There are no crosses here." Well, the Bible says you have to have a cross, doesn't it? Shiny and with a light on it, because, Jesus' cross was all smooth and lighted and beautiful. Again, believe me, I'm not suggesting crosses are idols and there's something terrible about them. But I'm saying, if we're serious about reaching beyond religious boundaries, religious symbols are very confusing. The cross for much of our world is a symbol of military might. They have no understanding of what the cross is in terms of any theological meaning. The cross is what soldiers wore on their uniforms when they took over our country. So they walk into church and there are 50 crosses everywhere. The choir comes in with crosses on. That's a barrier. So, and again, I'm not saying this is therefore get rid of crosses in church. I'm saying you need to ask about what your mission is. And if your mission is to reach people for whom that cross is going to keep them from hearing the gospel about the cross, because you want a shiny, pretty, lighted, polished, then that's a problem. Are we willing to accept the cross as a theological concept, as what happened Jesus died on the cross. That's the center of our faith, center of our salvation. But whether or not I have a shiny one dangling around my neck, I'm not sure has too much to do with my salvation. So Hibbert says the symbol of the cross is another form that offends Muslims, not primarily because of what it expresses about Jesus, but because of its association in people's minds with the Crusades and the abuses of colonialism or of Christian powers. So again, I'm not telling you to change anything. I'm saying we need to think through everything today in light of our mission. And then for the person who says, I will follow Jesus, and their parents say, well, don't call us anymore. Do they have any family after that? This means as a church, we have to, and the truth is, this is not just true of people of other religions. This is true of a lot of people who know that becoming a Christian is not going to go over that well with their friends. What kind of support will the church offer for converts from other faiths? And will those supports be strong enough to fill a void left when family and friends reject them, or when they miss the old rituals that have been their identity? Will Christians be willing to be sensitive about dress and diet when the convert is a new Christian? When a Hindu becomes a Christian, are we going to say to them the next day, okay, now you need to start eating beef? It's the Christian thing to do. Which is silly. Okay, and we'll just end off. We've got 10 minutes. What are the challenges we face when seeking to be witnesses to people with no religion or people who practice another religion? And how can we overcome those challenges? So can you just talk to about 4 people right around you just for 5 minutes about those 2 questions? What are the challenges we face? And how do we overcome those challenges? Maybe even 6 or 7 minutes. So grab a few people right around you and start real quick because I talk too long.